For 600 years, one family ruled half of Europe. They owned Spain, Austria, Hungary, the Netherlands, Mexico. They commanded armies of millions. They married their own cousins, then their nieces, then their sisters, generation after generation, for 6 centuries, until the last Habsburg king could not walk, could not speak, could not chew his own food. He died at 38, without a single heir, and the greatest royal dynasty in history died with him. Not conquered by an enemy, not overthrown by revolution, destroyed entirely by its own bloodline. In the year 1438, a European noble family climbed to a position of power so complete, so sweeping, and so seemingly permanent that historians would later struggle to find adequate comparisons anywhere in the recorded history of Western civilization. The family was the House of Habsburg. At the absolute peak of their empire, they controlled Spain and its entire colonial empire in the Americas, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, the Netherlands, large parts of Italy, and the Philippines. Their territories spanned 5 continents. Their treasury received silver from the mines of Bolivia and gold from the rivers of Mexico. Their armies were the most feared fighting forces in Europe. When the Habsburg emperor spoke, popes listened. When Habsburg diplomats arrived at a negotiating table, kingdoms adjusted their borders. For 600 years, the Habsburgs did not just participate in European history. They were European history. Every major war, every royal marriage, every shifting alliance on the continent for 6 centuries ran through the Habsburg family in some essential way. They produced Holy Roman emperors, Spanish kings, Austrian archdukes, and queens of France, England, Portugal, and Hungary. They built cathedrals, patronized artists, commissioned Velázquez and Titian, and constructed palaces of such extravagant beauty that tourists still travel from every corner of the world to stand inside them. And then, in November 1700, the last Habsburg King of Spain died in his bed at the age of 38. His name was Charles II. He had never fathered a child. He could barely walk. His speech was so impaired that strangers often could not understand him. His jaw was so deformed, a physical feature now known historically as the Habsburg jaw, that he could not properly chew solid food. Contemporary accounts described him as having been an invalid for most of his adult life, plagued by physical and cognitive difficulties so severe that his court had spent decades quietly preparing for the inevitable. When he died, he left no heir, no stable succession, and a power vacuum so enormous that it triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that drew in every major European power and reshaped the political map of the continent. The physical deterioration of Charles II was not an accident of nature. It was the direct biological consequence of a deliberate dynastic strategy that the Habsburgs had pursued with increasing intensity across generations, the strategy of intermarriage within the family itself. The logic behind Habsburg inbreeding was, from their own perspective, entirely rational. Marriage was the primary tool of diplomatic alliance in medieval and early modern Europe. When a Habsburg princess married a foreign prince, the alliance it created was valuable, but it also transferred wealth, territory, and dynastic claims outside the family. The Habsburgs, who had spent generations accumulating the most extraordinary collection of territories and titles in European history, were deeply reluctant to see any of that inheritance dispersed through marriage to outsiders. Their solution was to keep marriages within the family. A Habsburg would marry another Habsburg. Cousins would marry cousins. Uncles would marry nieces. The bloodline and the inheritance would remain concentrated, controlled, and undiminished. In the early generations of this practice, the consequences were not obviously catastrophic. The Habsburgs of the 15th and early 16th centuries were, by most accounts, physically capable and intellectually formidable people. Charles V, who ruled the Habsburg Empire at its absolute territorial peak in the mid-16th century, was a competent military commander and an astute political operator who managed an empire of staggering complexity with genuine skill. His jaw showed the early signs of the Habsburg physical trait. It protruded noticeably, making him self-conscious enough that portraits often depicted him in profile, but it did not impair his function. He was, by the standards of his era, a successful ruler. But Charles V was himself the product of a royal marriage between closely related individuals, and his son Philip II of Spain continued the family tradition. Philip II married his own niece, Anna of Austria. Their son, Philip III, married a distant cousin. Philip III's son, Philip IV, married his own niece. And Philip the fourth's son was Charles II, the product of a family tree so tangled with repeated intermarriage that geneticists studying his lineage centuries later calculated his inbreeding coefficient at 0.254, a level higher than the child of a brother and sister would typically produce. Every generation of Habsburg marriage had compounded the genetic consequences of the one before it, until Charles II represented the biological accumulation of 2.5 centuries of concentrated inbreeding. The physical manifestations were comprehensive and severe. The famous Habsburg jaw, technically prognathism, a protrusion of the lower jaw, had become so extreme in Charles II that his teeth did not meet properly, making chewing nearly impossible. He suffered from epilepsy. He was chronically ill throughout his life. His growth was severely stunted. He did not begin to walk until he was 8 years old. He was not considered capable of formal education until he was 10. His 2 marriages, to Marie Louise of Orleans and subsequently to Maria Anna of Neuburg, produced no children, a failure attributed at the time to divine punishment and attributed by modern medicine to the near certainty that Charles II was functionally infertile as a direct consequence of his genetic condition. What makes the Habsburg story uniquely instructive is that the warning signs were visible and documented long before the final collapse. Medical observers at the Spanish court had been noting the declining physical robustness of the Spanish Habsburg line for decades before Charles II was born. The pattern was clear enough that it was discussed, quietly and obliquely, in diplomatic correspondence across Europe. Yet the marriage strategy continued unchanged, because the alternative, opening the Habsburg bloodline to outsiders and accepting the dilution of family control over their territories, was considered worse than the biological consequences they were accumulating. This was the essential character of Habsburg greed. Not greed in the simple sense of wanting money. The Habsburgs had more money than any other family in Europe and spent much of it generously on art, architecture, and religious patronage. Their greed was dynastic and territorial. It was the greed of a family so obsessed with retaining every acre of land and every fragment of political power they had ever acquired that they were willing to sacrifice the biological viability of their own bloodline rather than risk losing control of any of it through marriage alliances with outside families. The consequences extended far beyond the biological. The Habsburg obsession with territorial retention also shaped their political decision-making in ways that progressively weakened their empire. They resisted necessary reforms that might have required sharing power with emerging national and commercial interests. They fought wars to retain territories, in the Netherlands, in Italy, in the Americas, that were becoming increasingly expensive to hold and increasingly restive under Habsburg rule. They spent the silver of the Americas on military campaigns that produced temporary victories and permanent debt. By the time Charles II died in 1700, the Spanish Habsburg Empire was not just dynastically extinct, it was financially exhausted, militarily overstretched, and administratively hollowed out by a century of attempting to govern half the world from the same palace in Madrid where Philip II had once commanded the Armada. The Austrian branch of the Habsburgs survived the extinction of the Spanish line and continued to rule in Central Europe for another 2 centuries, finally ending with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the conclusion of the First World War in 1918. The last Habsburg emperor, Charles I, was exiled to the Portuguese island of Madeira, where he died of pneumonia in 1922 at the age of 34. With his death, the political house of Habsburg effectively ceased to exist as a ruling dynasty, ending a continuous period of dynastic power that had lasted almost exactly 500 years. The Habsburg story has entered the language of both medicine and political science as a case study in the consequences of closed systems, biological or institutional, that prioritize self-preservation over adaptation. In medicine, the Habsburg jaw remains the textbook example of how recessive genetic traits are expressed and amplified through inbreeding. In political science, Habsburg Spain is the standard reference point for imperial overextension, the phenomenon by which great powers exhaust themselves trying to hold together empires too large and too diverse to be governed from a single center. But perhaps the deepest lesson of the Habsburgs is simpler and more universal than any academic framework. They had everything. They had territory, wealth, military power, cultural prestige, and 6 centuries of institutional knowledge about how to rule. What they could not do was share. Not their land, not their titles, not their bloodline. And that inability to share, that determination to keep everything within the family, to pass every inheritance intact to the next generation of Habsburgs and no one else, is what ultimately consumed them from within, as surely and as completely as any external enemy could ever have done. The greatest dynasty in European history was not conquered. It was not overthrown. It simply ran out of heirs. And the reason it ran out of heirs is that it refused, for 600 years, to let anyone else in.